These are the hidden details that turn the most famous winter landscape in art history into something far more unsettling than it appears. The painting is called Hunters in the Snow. It was painted by Pieter Bruegel the Elder in the year 1565, and at first glance, it is the most peaceful winter scene you could imagine. Snow, ice skaters, a few hunters returning home. But the longer you look at it, the more things start to go wrong. And today we are going to look at it properly. We are going to start with the obvious, with what anyone sees when they stand in front of the painting. And from there, we are going to go deeper, layer by layer, down to the corners that almost no one notices, because each one of those corners shifts the story a little. And by the time we reach the end, that feeling of calm we started with will have turned into something else entirely. So let us begin with the basics. What exactly are we looking at? Hunters in the Snow is an oil on oak panel. It measures just over 1 meter tall by 1.5 meters wide, and today it hangs in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, in the room the museum itself dedicates to Bruegel. At the bottom center it is signed and dated, with the painter's name and the year, 1565, in Roman numerals. But this painting was never meant to hang alone. It was part of a series. A banker and merchant from Antwerp, named Nicolaes Jongelink, commissioned Bruegel to paint a cycle of paintings depicting the seasons of the year, most likely for the dining room of his country house on the outskirts of the city. Picture it as a frieze, a continuous band of landscapes running around the walls of the room. And here the first oddity appears, one that is not on the canvas, but in the very concept of the cycle. We, today, divide the year into 4 seasons. We would paint 4 pictures: spring, summer, autumn, winter. But in the 16th century Low Countries, an older tradition was still followed, one that divided the year into 6 periods, 6 seasons of unequal length, with the count beginning on the 1st of March. That is why the cycle did not have 4 panels. It had 6, and of those 6, 5 survive. They are spread today among Vienna, Prague, and New York. There is the gloomy day, corresponding to the end of winter and the start of spring. There is the haymaking, from the beginning of summer. There are the harvesters, with the wheat of late summer, which today hangs in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. There is the return of the herd, from autumn. And there is this one, Hunters in the Snow, which closes the series and represents the months of December and January. The 6th panel, the one for spring, for April and May, has been lost. The fact that this painting is the winter of a cycle matters more than it seems, and we will see why in a moment. But before the small details, there is something large that needs naming, because it is what you feel, physically, when you look at the painting: the cold. Bruegel's genius here is that the cold is not explained, it is transmitted. The Vienna Museum puts it very directly in its own text. It is not the sum of the details that makes this painting great. It is its overall effect. Bruegel masterfully evokes the impression of a permanent cold, and that is why it is recognized as the first and most important winter landscape in all of European painting. And everything conspires toward that sensation. The trees are black silhouettes, bare branches coated in a thin layer of snow. The hunters walk hunched over, heads down, sinking into the deep snow. The dogs are gaunt, their ears drooping, and the entire palette, whites, grays, ashen blues, and above all those pale, almost spectral greens of the frozen water, makes the image itself seem frozen. The watermill is immobilized by ice. The river is frozen solid, and not a single snowflake is falling. The sky is overcast, but completely still, as if the entire scene were trapped inside a snow globe. And here it is worth pausing, because this is no ordinary winter. When Bruegel paints this work, around 1565, Europe is passing through a period of cooling. Scientists call it the Little Ice Age, a phase of lower temperatures that stretched, according to current dating, from roughly the year 1300 to 1850. And within that long period, the 1560s are considered the first decade of truly extreme weather. The winter of 1564 to 65, precisely the one depicted in this painting, is cited as one of the coldest of the century. And what did that mean in practice? It meant that the great commercial rivers of the region, the Scheldt and the Meuse, the arteries along which goods flowed, froze over completely. Transport ground to a halt. Food began to grow scarce. Firewood became so expensive that a single sack could cost the equivalent of 2 weeks' wages. And there are records of households that resorted to burning their own wooden floors to keep from freezing to death. On the 2nd of January 1565, an enormous block of ice entered the port of Delfshaven and blocked access to the river. According to the inscription on a painting from the period, that block measured nearly 6 meters tall and 70 meters wide. It was painted, precisely, to preserve the memory of how extraordinary it was. So the weather is not a backdrop in this painting. The weather is, very nearly, the protagonist. It should be said, however, that the link between Bruegel's winters and those freezing years deserves a degree of caution. His first snow landscape, The Adoration of the Kings in the Snow, has been redated to 1563, that is, before the harshest winter. But what is beyond dispute is that Bruegel, virtually single-handedly, founded the genre of the winter landscape in Western painting. Before him, it barely existed. And speaking of what Bruegel invented, and what he copied from reality, let us now look at the background, because there is something there that, quite simply, cannot be. At the back of the painting, closing off the landscape, rises an imposing chain of jagged mountains. The problem is that those mountains do not exist. Not in the Low Countries, which are flat. There is nothing there, not even remotely, resembling those peaks. Where did they come from then? From Bruegel's memory. Years before painting this work, around the middle of the century, Bruegel had made a long journey to Italy. He traveled down to Rome. He went as far south as Reggio di Calabria, and to get home, he crossed the Alps. And that experience lodged in his mind in a way that would mark his entire body of work. His biographer, Karel van Mander, recounted it, as early as the year 1604, with an image that has become famous. He said that when Bruegel was in the Alps, he swallowed all those mountains and rocks, and that, upon returning home, he spat them back out onto canvases and panels. And that is exactly what we are seeing. Bruegel is blending landscapes that never coincided in reality. The Flemish plain below, and the Alps in the background, to construct something that is not a specific place, but an idea. The very idea of winter. And that is the key point for understanding everything that comes next. Because this painting does not portray a real village. It aspires to be winter, with a capital W, the essence of an entire season. Every element Bruegel chooses to place inside, it is there for a reason. Nothing is accidental, and the moment we start looking with that idea in mind, the tranquil scene begins to crack. Let us start with the hunters themselves. We follow the steps of 3 weary men, climbing a hill on their way back from the hunt, with a pack of dogs as dispirited as they are. And that word, dispirited, is the key, because if we ask ourselves what they have caught, the answer is almost nothing. From one of the spears hangs a single fox, just one, scrawny. And here is a detail that a modern viewer misses entirely, but that, at the time, would have been understood instantly. The fox was not a prized quarry. It was not hunted for its meat. It was hunted to protect the chickens or to make use of its fur. The spears these men carry are for big game, for wild boar or deer, and they are returning with a skinny fox. In other words, the expedition has been a failure. And Bruegel reinforces that idea with an even smaller detail. Just ahead of the nearest hunter, in the snow, there is a set of tracks. The tracks of a hare that, in all likelihood, managed to escape them. The prey that got away, drawn on the ground, so that we are left in no doubt about the outcome. Now, let us be honest, not all scholars read this as a total failure. Some point out that, given the type of dogs accompanying the men, the expected quarry was precisely hares, foxes, or birds, and that, in such a brutal winter, coming back with something would not be an absolute disaster, but rather a mediocre result. Yet most readings agree on the essential point. These men are returning defeated, and Bruegel wants us to notice. But that air of failure does not stay confined to the hunters. It seems to infect the object right beside them, hanging on the front of the inn, and that object is the first of the truly strange details. On the left there is an inn, and above its entrance hangs a sign. If we look closely, we see on it a man kneeling before a stag, with a cross, or a radiance, between the animal's antlers. There is even an inscription, half worn away by time, that has been read as, "This is the golden stag." That image represents Saint Hubert, the patron saint of hunters, and his legend fits this painting like a glove. Tradition has it that Hubert, after being widowed, gave himself over entirely to the hunt, to the point of going out hunting on a Good Friday while everyone else was at church, and that, in the middle of the chase, the stag he was pursuing turned around and revealed a radiant crucifix between its antlers, with a voice warning him to change his ways or be lost forever. Hubert converted and went on to become the Bishop of Liège. And here is a curious fact, the kind that makes a detail even stranger than it first appeared. That story of the stag with the cross was not originally Saint Hubert's. It belonged to another saint, Saint Eustace, a Roman general who, according to his own legend, had exactly the same vision while hunting. The scene of the stag was taken from Eustace and attributed to Hubert only from the 15th century onward. Two saints, the same apparition, both patron saints of hunters, but the truly unsettling thing about the sign is not what it depicts, it is how it is placed. Because the sign is crooked, it has almost come away from its fastenings, hanging precariously, as if about to fall to the ground at any moment. An insignificant detail? Perhaps. Or perhaps, the first warning that something is not right here. There is a reading, proposed by the art historian Reindert Falkenberg, that goes further. He suggests that the people in the painting have lost sight of precisely that Christ who hangs, swaying, above the tavern door. A kind of spiritual blindness. Everyone busy with their own affairs, and the divine sign about to come loose, without anyone looking at it. Hold on to that idea. The idea of people who cannot see the danger right in front of them, because it is coming back. But first, let us lower our gaze toward the village, toward the valley, where life seems to carry on with complete unconcern. Because even there, in the most idyllic vignette of the painting, Bruegel has hidden an alarm. Down below, on the frozen ponds, dozens of tiny figures give themselves over to winter pastimes. There are people skating. There is something resembling hockey. Someone appears to be playing a kind of curling. Someone is fishing through the ice. There are children. There are sleds. It is the brightest, happiest part of the painting. It contrasts completely with the defeated hunters on the left, and one might think that Bruegel is offering us, here, a gentle vision, almost happy, of village life. And then, the detail appears, tiny, extremely easy to overlook. Between the church and the bridge, there is a house, and from that house, smoke is rising. But it is not the peaceful smoke of a chimney lit against the cold. If we look carefully, the chimney is ablaze. A fire has broken out, and around it there is movement. Someone has climbed onto the roof. Others are arriving with ladders, trying to put out the flames. It is a minuscule detail, I admit, but it changes the entire atmosphere of the scene, because, suddenly, that peaceful landscape seems far less safe than it appeared. And, suddenly, the ice on which that cheerful crowd skates so carelessly also seems more fragile, more likely to give way beneath their feet at any moment. This is Bruegel's signature in this painting. He has scattered across the entire landscape a series of small signals, signals that danger is there, latent, stalking, in silence, all those trusting little figures, stalking them, just as those birds perched on the branches above are stalking them. And the birds need to be taken seriously, because they are not there by chance. Up high, clearly visible on the bare branches, crows can be made out, and in the center of the image, crossing the sky, a magpie. These two species are not naturalistic decoration. In Bruegel's time, they were used to signal a bad omen, and the magpie, in particular, carried an even darker association. In Dutch culture, it was linked to the devil. The magpie was also a symbol of the gossiping tongue, of rumor and idle talk, and we know Bruegel thought this way, because he made it clear in another painting, The Magpie on the Gallows, a painting he made 3 years later, and which, according to his biographer Van Mander, he bequeathed to his own wife. In that work, the magpie represents gossiping tongues, tongues that Bruegel, symbolically, condemned to the gallows. So we have crows, and a magpie, omens that something bad looms over the scene, and the logical question would be, are these birds the threat? But Bruegel is subtler than that, and here we arrive at the most important detail in the entire painting, the one that reorders it completely, because right in the center, half hidden, there is a trap. Beside one of the trees, on the snow, there is a bird trap. It is a tiny object, a small dark speck, surrounded by birds, and it is extremely hard to imagine that Bruegel placed it there by chance, especially because we know it interested him greatly. That very same year, 1565, he painted an entire other work built around this object. That other painting is titled Winter Landscape with Skaters and a Bird Trap, and in it, the trap appears in the foreground, much larger, much more obvious. Its mechanism is simple, a board propped up on a stick, with a rope attached. When the birds approach the bait and venture underneath, someone pulls the rope, and the board falls on top of them. That painting became so famous that it was the most copied work by Bruegel. More than 120 copies have been documented, many of them made by his own son. And what does that trap mean? Here we enter the territory of interpretation, and it is worth saying so clearly. According to the reading proposed by the specialist Sabine van Sprang of the Royal Museums of Belgium, the trap refers to a conception of human existence widely held in the 16th century. The idea of the believer as a pilgrim crossing a life strewn with dangers and temptations that must be navigated in order to be saved. In the literature of the period, bird traps symbolized precisely the lures the devil sets for careless souls, and the bird, traditionally, was the symbol of the soul. Now, let us return to the painting with that idea. Look again at the skaters in the valley and at the birds in the sky. Notice how the human figures, in the distance, have become small dark silhouettes, the same color as the birds. Notice how, because of the way Bruegel has constructed the perspective, some birds appear almost the same size as the people in the background. Some are even perched on the same ice, blending in with the skaters, and then, the analogy becomes obvious. The birds approaching the trap and the people dancing on the ice are, at bottom, the same thing. As Van Sprang summarizes, skaters and birds find themselves here both for their carefree nature and for their vulnerability to the dangers looming over them. That idea we stored away earlier, of people blind to the warning right in front of them, now returns in full. The slippery ice is existence itself, uncertain, insecure, and all those happy little dots are skating without knowing that they, too, are heading toward a trap. With that, this winter landscape ceases to be a simple scene of everyday life. It begins to speak of the fragility of existence and of the precarious balance on which it rests. And once you understand that, what the painting breathes is no longer, exactly, tranquility. It is a soft melancholy. The melancholy of seeing, from above, those small figures who suspect nothing, and yet launch themselves, joyfully, onto the ice. But before we close the book on all of this, we need to be fair to the painting itself, because not all experts read it the same way. It is worth separating what is fact from what is interpretation. That there is a crooked sign, a fire, some crows, and a trap, that is fact. It is painted there. What they mean is another matter. And on that question, art historians have spent a long time disagreeing. There is one school that reads the painting primarily as a scene from real life, a work of naturalistic observation, of humanism, more interested in the effect of the cold and in the whole than in hidden messages. And it is no coincidence that the Vienna Museum itself insists on that overall effect and on the sensation of permanent cold above any specific symbol. And there is another school, Falkenberg's and others, which sees the series of the seasons as a meditation on divine order, and which reads each of these details, the sign, the trap, the birds, as an allegory of the pilgrimage of life, and of humanity's moral blindness. There is even a note of caution worth keeping in mind. Regarding the companion painting, the one with the trap, the relevant encyclopedia itself notes that many historians have attempted to extract a moral or allegorical meaning, without any of those proposals achieving general acceptance. And there is a technical fact that gives pause for thought. It has been discovered that the trap was not in the preparatory drawing beneath the paint. Bruegel added it over the snowy background at a late stage. It was a conscious decision, a last-minute one. So perhaps the honest answer is that both readings coexist, that the painting is, at once, an astonishingly real portrait of a particular winter, and a reflection on how fragile everything is, and that dual nature is, almost certainly, part of why we keep looking at it 5 centuries later. Because, indeed, we keep looking at it. Hunters in the Snow has become one of the most widely reproduced works in art history, the most recognizable winter landscape in existence, a fixture on Christmas cards, and it has enjoyed a second life outside of museums. Above all, in cinema, the Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky placed it at the center of his film Solaris in the year 1972. The painting appears floating in a zero-gravity scene, accompanied by the music of Bach, as a symbol of earth, of memory, of longing for home. And Tarkovsky loved it so much that he also used it in another of his films, Mirror. Decades later, Lars von Trier paid homage to it in Melancholia, from the year 2011. The painting appears in the film's slow-motion prologue, and, in a brutal gesture, it is seen burning. And the Iranian filmmaker Abbas Kiarostami did something even bolder in his final work, 24 Frames. He took this painting as the basis for his opening scene, and selectively animated the animals and birds within it, restoring the movement that Bruegel had frozen forever. All of them saw the same thing we have been seeing today, that beneath that tranquil surface, there is a depth that never runs out. We began with a painting that seemed almost like a postcard. 3 hunters, some skaters, snow, calm, and we have ended with a scrawny fox that betrays a failed hunt, a sacred sign about to come loose, a fire that no one seems to notice, birds of ill omen, and a trap hidden in the very center of the scene that turns all those happy people into souls walking, unknowingly, toward danger. That was the point. The longer you look at Hunters in the Snow, the stranger it becomes. Not because Bruegel hid puzzles to show off, but because he built an image that works on two levels at once. The calm you feel at the start, and the unease you discover at the end, both of them coexisting on the same frozen canvas. There is a phrase that Bruegel's friend Abraham Ortelius left in writing, just a few years after his death. He said that in all his works, more is always understood than is painted. Scholars caution that it was, in part, an elegant formula of the period, a complement fashioned from classical commonplaces. But standing before this particular painting, looking at that crooked sign and that trap you can barely see, it is hard not to agree with him. Look again. There is always something more.